Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to my webinar on examples of environmental racism in the DMV region. So my name is Absa and I'm the DMV Regional Coordinator for ThinkOcean, which means that I handle all the ThinkOcean related issues within the DC, Maryland, and Virginia region. This particular webinar on environmental racism is focused mainly on the DMV region because that's what I know. But I do hope that you all leave this webinar with the knowledge that this is a global problem rather than just one from just the DMV region. I also want to add that this webinar is a part of our One World United by Crisis series. So introduction, the Forgotten River, an example of environmental racism. So the Anacostia, often referred to as the Forgotten River, is one of the US's most heavily polluted bodies of water. Due to its location in the heart of urban development, it is subject to massive amounts of waste being dumped into its banks. The river runs from Bladensburg, Maryland, to Washington, D.C., and it's a comparatively small tributary of the Chesapeake Bay, being only 8.7 miles long. So here's a map of the Anacostia River in just the DC region. Despite its small size, its heavily polluted waters impact the millions of people who live around and or near it. So the story of the Anacostia River is one of discrimination, pollution, and divide. This webinar will take a deeper dive into the river's history and explain how the river got to be so polluted. It will also cover the impact of the toxins on the flora and fauna, as well as the surrounding neighborhoods. Lastly, we'll look at the costs and the benefits associated with cleaning the river and show some solutions that have already been put into place. So background information, why is it called the Forgotten River and what happened to the riverfront community? So let's start with the first question. Why is it called the Forgotten River? It all boils down to a lack of proper legislation. The river is often called forgotten because for decades, the waste was allowed to build up inside of the water without anyone stopping it. This allowed for runoff from places like sewage treatment plants, lawns, landfills, and factories to build up in the water and create a toxic ecosystem. Okay, sorry, I meant to change the slide. And so this leads to eutrophication, which is essentially when a buildup of nutrients happen in the water. And these nutrients can be anything from phosphorus to nitrogen and general things that come from fertilizers. And then causes rapid growth of algae, which can give the water this greenish tint to it. Eventually, all of the algae soaks up the nutrients and blocks the sunlight for plants, and that's needed at the lower levels. With the loss of sunlight and nutrients, all the algae dies and continues to block the sunlight to lower level plants, causing them to die too. So without these plants producing oxygen, this all culminates into a dramatic decrease in dissolved oxygen in the water. In short, the waste piled up in the river's banks due to a lack of legislation to enforce those proper disposal of these chemicals, and the Anacostia's ecosystem paid the price. Okay. So this slide answers what happened to the riverfront community. So well, as I'm sure you all are aware of, the pollution of the Anacostia River doesn't only affect the organisms that live inside of the water, but also the community surrounding it. So namely Ward 7 and 8, who are on the eastern side of the river. So this is a map of like the wards of DC, and you can see how it divides the east from the west. So this is like where the Anacostia River runs through, and these are wards 7 and 8, which are predominantly African American, which is on the eastern side, and then the other side is obviously the western side. So the people who live in these wards are predominantly Black and brown and lower income communities. This is not by accident, but rather the result of targeted government effort through a system called redlining. Essentially, people of color were forced to buy or rent homes in specific locations through this redlining. And I will go into further detail about it later. Afterwards, these neighborhoods were left to fend for themselves while their richer, less diverse counterparts were given more government benefits. The conditions in the community were made worse because of how they were forced to live next to heavily polluted ecosystems. Okay, so this has led the Anacostia into becoming a symbolic dividing line, separating the district's wealthy west from the disadvantaged east, and reflecting the stark racial and socioeconomic divisions of the city. Clearly, fixing the Anacostia doesn't only mean cleaning up the river. We have to additionally heal this racial and economic isolation. So when living near a polluted body of water like the Anacostia, it's crucial for the community to have access to resources that can protect them from the toxic water. Unfortunately, these wards have been subjected to improper government regulation for a long time. And they don't have the luxury of accessing things like an expensive water filter that can leach out the toxin, that can leach out these toxins. At the end of the day, sometimes it can feel like not enough people care about these people or their situation. I do want to mention, though, that there are advocates fighting for them and that their work is crucial, but there's still a long way to go. So before I move on, I do want to highlight another loss to the riverfront community, and that is the loss of cultural significance and tourist revenue. So due to the heavy pollution, people don't hang out near the water as much as they wish they could. Sometimes people take out boats and canoes onto the Anacostia, but even then the river has bad odors and harmful chemicals, so it isn't always safe. In short, there's a whole level of cultural significance that this river has to offer, but it's too dangerous for people to enjoy it. So we will take a closer look at these types of impacts. So the Anacostia River and this community are connected. So when the Anacostia is suffering, the people are suffering. Decades of pollution and poor legislation have led to a dirty river and a marginalized community. As mentioned before, awareness about the river's toxicity has led to a movement to solve this crisis. Though it's crucial that we look at the intersectionality of the environmental, social, and economic impacts to truly understand the river. To put it simply, as long as these social and economic issues exist, environmental consequences are sure to follow. So let's take a look at the social impacts now. So how does race and class play a factor on the situation? So the first step in truly understanding the social impacts is understanding redlining. During the height of the civil rights movement, there was a flood of African Americans moving into more urban environments between 1950 and 1966. Major cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and San Francisco doubled their Black population in this short period of time. So some government officials felt threatened by the sudden increase of Black people, and they scrambled to find a way to regulate their migration. The result of this regulation is redlining. The term was coined as a direct description of how policymakers would outline certain neighborhoods in red as they planned out where they wanted certain demographics to live. Although this is not just policymakers, different professions also helped reinforce this new social standard. So for example, bankers would deny a loan to African Americans for a certain house, and real estate investors would refuse to show particular homes to Black people. So the following slides show the long-lasting impact of redlining, even though it has long since been made illegal. This quote says, racial discrimination barred Black people from the expanding suburbs to which whites were moving in growing numbers. And so during those years, the color line became marked as boldly as ever. To be clear, redlining was a carefully crafted plan that succeeded in doing exactly what it was meant to do. So statistics show how divided the Anacostia is. So for example, east of the river are wards 7 and 8, which are about 94% Black, African American or Black. So as you can see, the darker the red on the map shown here is where more Black people live. And so in addition to this racial discrimination, there's a clear difference in how the two groups are being treated, especially when it comes to the level of pollution that they're exposed to. So the pollution levels of the Anacostia River got so severe in the 1990s that they issued a ban on consuming fish from the Anacostia River that mainly targeted pregnant women and children. These are the types of people that are most vulnerable to the variety of toxins that can be found in this fish. The pollution of the river leached into the soil and poisoned the riverfront community, striking them with illness after illness. This is made worse by the combination of contaminated water and contaminated air, which causes asthma and cancers. Because the Anacostia community were people of color, governments didn't care about regulating the pollution levels, allowing the situation to get worse and worse. The story of the Anacostia community shows how um, the story of the Anacostia community shows how different factors come together to keep minorities trapped in a cycle of poverty and sickness. So let's look at the environmental impacts on the river due to this lack of legislation. So the most obvious environmental consequence from the river is its heavy pollution. The Washington Navy Yard leaks PCBs from 11 unregistered outfalls that contaminate the shore and the water. PCBs are man-made chemicals that are highly toxic because of how they can accumulate in the body. A little bit of PCBs won't kill you, but constant contact with them definitely can. They were banned in 1977, but they were persistent chemicals, which means that it takes a ridiculously long time for them to disappear from the environment. Almost 50 years later, PCBs can be found contaminating the Anacostia River and its organisms. So let's take a closer look at point and non-point sources. So for those of you that don't know, point sources are essentially sources of pollution that are easily identifiable, while non-point sources are the opposite. So the Anacostia deals with both of these, so they're important to understand. So let's look at the point sources first. Runoff from landfills, recycling facilities, and sewage treatment plants contribute to the influx of toxic chemicals. A lot of these chemicals lead to bioaccumulation like PCBs. When it comes to monocultures, runoff from those farms tend to be mostly fertilizers, which leads to eutrophication, as I mentioned before. So when it comes to the non-point sources though, there are simply too many individuals to identify a particular source. Different kinds of runoff takes place. So for example, the roads. Since this is an urban development, there are several roads and highways that surround the Anacostia, contributing to oil and grease-soaked groundwater poisoning the waters. This is exacerbated by the fact that the roads can't filter out the toxins in the way that soil would. So instead, the road's flat surface gives toxic chemicals a direct path into the river. Additionally, the exhaust fumes of vehicles poison the air of the animals and the people who live in the surrounding communities, which has led to disturbing rates of blood contamination and asthma. Furthermore, landfills and recycling facilities are located near the banks of the Anacostia. So these examples aren't even counting the number of people that litter around the banks of the Anacostia. Washington, D.C.'s urban development is the direct cause of a massive influx of pollutants dirtying the river and the air. So here are some pictures of the Anacostia so you can see the waste buildup and like the brownish water. So you can see here, like just a bunch of waste, and then like the water is not the color that water should be. So this slide takes a closer look at some of the toxins. This slide takes a closer look at some of the waters in the water due to urbanization. Things like PCBs, carcinogens, endocrine disruptors have made the water toxic. I also wanted to take a look at the buildup of silt because silt floats up at the top of the water, and so it contributes to blocking sunlight and preventing fish from catching their prey. So these toxic waters have harmed the fauna surrounding the Anacostia River. The bioaccumulation has led to species like the red spider newt, peregrine falcon, and the marbled salamander to face extinction. These environmental problems build on each other until they create unlivable conditions and an increased threat of extinction. So lastly, we're going to take a look at how the economy has been impacted by the pollution. So recently, there has been a big push for legislation to restore the river. Unfortunately, government officials had allowed the conditions of the river to get so bad that there isn't enough resources, money, or advanced technology to fully fix the river. Yet recent research shows that the benefits of a clean Anacostia outweighs the cost of actually cleaning it up. It has been proven that cleaner water will boost the economy of these riverfront communities and help the DMV region, the entire DMV region. So a report by the World Bank said that a clean river will attract an estimated $25 billion in private and public investment. It is also projected to generate $1.5 billion of additional tax revenue. So solutions, what has already been done to solve this and what still needs to be done? As I mentioned before, an increase in public awareness and advocacy groups have put a lot of pressure on political officials to clean up the river. I also mentioned PCBs earlier in the webinar and how they were banned in the 1970s. So these chemicals had an adverse effect on the local ecosystem, and their ban shows that the right regulation can return the Anacostia River to its former glory. For example, local blowheads were constantly being exposed to PCBs, which led to an increase of liver tumors in their species. So now that PCBs have been banned, research has shown that there has been a 50% decrease in the probability that a bullhead will contract a liver tumor between 1996 and 2000. That statistic has since risen to a 75% decrease in probability from 2014 to 2016. This study shows the impact that policymakers can have on the river and further reinforces that legislation plays a key role in the restoration of the Anacostia. Another potential solution came about when the DC Office of Planning launched the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative Framework Plan in September of 2003, which covers about 2,830 acres of land. The goal of this plan is to combine technology, money, and community outreach programs to both clean the Anacostia and reinvigorate the communities surrounding it. Policymakers made sure that the AWI embodied the triple bottom line approach. In short, the AWI wants to turn the forgotten Anacostia River into a thriving economic community. So here's a quote that I thought summed it up nicely. The riverfront is imagined as a source of economic opportunity, a catalyst of growth that will create jobs, stimulate business activity, and enhance the tax base. The benefits are supposed to expand into the surrounding neighborhoods and bring wealth to both sides of the river. The union of the two sides of the Anacostia is necessary for creating a long-term solution for the river. It has been shown time and time again that the public and the river are interconnected, and both need to thrive to have a real solution. When it comes to restoring the Anacostia, bridging the east and the west sides are a vital step in the process. So the AWI has been a relative success since its first launch. So for example, the plan has put a system into place to mitigate the damages done by the sewage treatment system in the DC area. This is in response to the vast amount of pollution that has been put into the river due to DC's failing sewer system. Specifically, the AWI has launched the long-term control plan, which is a mega project of underground tunnels that are supposed to capture and treat sewer overflows and reduce future overflows. It will cost $2.6 billion and is expected to prevent 98% of future pollution and to be fully operational by 2022. So this plan is revolutionary and will vastly improve the river's water quality. So this plan is not the end all be all, though. There is still a long way to go. For example, the eastern side of the river has undergone a slower economic growth than the western side, despite the fact that the AWI was launched over a decade ago. The slowed momentum is in part due to the fact that the eastern side of the river belongs mostly to the National Park Services and the military, so there are certain developmental constraints. So conclusion, what does the Anacostia River tell us about the wider world? So most of the time, environmental issues focus on the ecosystem, plants, and animals. Rarely do people speak about the intersectionality of the environmental movement and how environmental damages directly impact humans. The crisis at this river will not be solved within a week, a year, even a decade. The solution lies in completely rethinking how people view their relationship with the environment and talking about the proper steps necessary to prevent adding any more pollutants. The solution will take bridging the gap between two communities that are torn apart by racial and socioeconomic inequalities. The solution will take technology beyond what we can comprehend right now. The solution will take time, but in the end, there will be a cleaner river and an elevated community. This webinar sheds a light on just one river and just one community and its relationship. But it's a good representative of environmental racism in the wider world. There are Superfund sites near Black communities, pipelines on indigenous land, and way too many communities like Flint, Michigan, who still don't have clean water. Just as with the Anacostia, River, the solution to environmental racism will take time and a lot of healing. But that can't happen until people realize that environmental justice isn't just about saving the bees and metal straws. It's about how people of color have been disproportionately affected by environmental damages. It's about acknowledging this pain, this struggle, and then vowing to do better. The big concept that I want you all to take away from this presentation is that environmental racism is a global problem, and we need more people to talk about it if anything is ever going to change. Okay, so that includes my portion of the webinar. I hope that it was informative, and thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or are interested in joining ThinkOcean, you can always reach me at dmvrc@thinkoceanglobal.org. So now I would like to introduce you to our two wonderful speakers that we have today who will share some of the work that they do and how they tackle environmental racism. So first we have Ariel Trahan, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing the last name, who is the Director of River Restoration Programs at the Anacostia Watershed Society. And she'll be speaking about what the organization does to revitalize the Anacostia River. After her, we will have Andrea Palframan. I'm sorry again if I mispronounced the last name. Okay, awesome. Who is the Director of Communication for Raven Trust, which is based in Canada, and that organization tackles the preservation of Indigenous rights, especially when it comes to the destruction of the environment. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing now. Let's see if I can. I'm so sorry, you all. I'm not tech savvy at all. Yeah. Okay, and I'll give it over to Ariel.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, can you guys see that? Okay, great. I'm just going to put it into slideshow mode. Give me 1 second here. Oh, sorry. Okay, there we go. All right, so again, thanks for having me. My name is Ariel Trahan, and I am with the Anacostia Watershed Society. So we are a local nonprofit based here in the region, and we were founded in 1989 with the goal of making the Anacostia River swimmable and fishable. And so that is based on the Clean Water Act. And so that is what we are working towards. And as Absa said, of course, we're working to restore and protect the Anacostia River and its watershed communities, right? Because we want to improve the water quality, but we also want to really reconnect people to the river, because for so long, people have been disconnected from the river. So a lot of the work that we do is focused on actually improving water quality as well as reconnecting people to the river. So again, our goal is swimmable and fishable by 2025. And the tools that we use to do that, we do a lot of stewardship projects. So we do a lot of rain gardens, stormwater management, tree plantings, wetland restoration, kind of ecosystem restoration level stuff. And we also do a lot of education programs, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes, and recreation, getting people out on the river, as well as advocacy. So advocating for policies that are going to have a positive impact on the river. So those are our main things. Like I said, we were founded in 1989. We have a staff of about 18 people. And so we do a lot of work throughout DC, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, working at sort of various levels, working with youth, working with adults, working with federal government, working with the local government. So kind of pulling all the levers that we can to get to a cleaner and healthier river and community. So again, Absa touched on this a little bit, so I'll go through this part quickly, but the main issue that we have facing the Anacostia River is because we are in such an urban area, we get a lot of runoff that's coming into the river. So it has to do with the land use, right? That's of course where all the pollution is coming from in any body of water, is it's coming in off of the land. And so for us, because we have so many surfaces that are roads and parking lots and buildings rather than, you know, meadows and forests and green spaces that can absorb that water, we get a lot more runoff coming into the river, and that's what's bringing in a lot of that pollution. So this map kind of places for you the Anacostia watershed within the larger Potomac River watershed and the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So of course, watersheds are nesting systems. So everything that is in that little yellow area, that's our Anacostia watershed, that's that drainage area, but that all then flows into the Potomac, that all flows out into the Chesapeake, and then of course that all flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. So our organization is focused specifically on the Anacostia River, but that is part of that larger restoration of the Chesapeake Bay and the ocean restoration as well. Of course, we are a very urban watershed. We have over 1 million people that live within that watershed. And so we work with the communities along the river itself, but also with the communities all throughout the watershed, helping people to understand that they might be in a spot where the river is 5 miles away from them. They might never have seen the river. They might not feel like it's connected to their community, but helping people understand what a watershed is and understanding that they do have an impact on the environment. The environment has an impact on them no matter where they are. So again, like I said, the big issue is the types of land surfaces that we have, right? So pervious versus impervious. We have a lot of impervious surfaces, so we get a lot of runoff. That brings a lot of stormwater into our Anacostia River. This map again shows you kind of placing it in that larger context of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And this shows you, quite simply, the red areas are where we have higher levels of impervious surface, right? So you can see, of course, we're sort of in that big hot spot there in the sort of DC, Baltimore area. We just have a lot of roads, we have a lot of parking lots, we have a lot of buildings, and so we're getting a lot of runoff and therefore a lot of pollution getting into our waterways. So the main thing that we really need to do to address that issue of stormwater, right, is we really need to try to figure out ways to slow it down. We can do that using plans, right? Spread it out, let it soak into the ground, right? In a lot of ways, it's really that simple, but of course, there become other complicating factors. But the main thing that we really need to do with that stormwater is slow it down, spread it out, and get it soaked back into the ground. This slide shows you the problems that stormwater brings into our waterways, right? Because it's the volume of the water itself. When we have, if you think about yesterday, how it rained so much and all that water had nowhere to go, it's running off of all of our roads. It's going into our Anacostia River. The water gets super high, right? We had some flooding in certain spots. So that's the volume of water, but there's also the issue of what the water is picking up as it's running over those roads and what it's bringing with it that's ending up in our waterways. So trash is a huge issue, excess nutrients, thermal pollution, the fact that it heats up when it goes over that blacktop, toxins, anything that's on our roadways that gets picked up, sediment, if we don't have enough plants to hold that in place, and then sewage, as Absa mentioned, that we have an antiquated sewer system in our watershed. We, of course, need infrastructure upgrades across many areas, but water is certainly one of them. And so we do have still some issues with sewage as well. So I just wanted to touch on trash for a minute because that one is such a visible thing. And in a lot of our work of really trying to, work with communities, work with students, work with adults, and really trying to sort of shift the narrative about the Anacostia River. I always say that that's a big part of our work is not just cleaning up the river, but also shifting the narrative about the river, because we could clean up the river and it could be clean, it could be crystal clear, it could be ready for people to swim and fish in it. But if everybody still has it in their mind that, it's this polluted place that they shouldn't go, then we haven't succeeded, right? So all of our work is hand in hand trying to improve water quality and also engage people in that process. And so trash is a really, visible entry point for people. And so we do a lot of work focused on raising awareness about trash and also, of course, trying to reduce trash. So this obviously shows you how the trash gets into the water. Sadly, I think we're all familiar with those pathways of littering and how trash ends up in our waterways. And I just wanted to touch on some of the things that we do to deal with trash, again, because it is such a visible entry point for people. And even when our organization started in 1989, there was a lot of focus on, of course, trying to reduce the sewage and the toxins, but also really focusing on the trash, because that is something that is going to engage people and really try to, start turning the tide. It's harder to get people engaged and like, be part of this lawsuit to get rid of the toxins in the river, right? Sometimes that can be more abstract for people. Some people, it's easier for them to identify with, like, let's clean up your neighborhood. Let's make sure that your neighborhood is clean and safe, and that's going to have a positive impact on the river. So, of course, both are important, but trash has always been a focus for us for that reason. So we do a lot of cleanups in the neighborhoods. We do a lot of beautification murals on the storm drains, trying to raise awareness of the fact that, our communities are connected to our waterways, that drain is, whatever goes down that drain is ending up in the Anacostia River. So we do a lot of community art projects. We also do work on legislation. So things like some successes that we've had include with bags and styrofoam. So in DC, we have a bag bill, the same thing in Montgomery County, right? We have to pay 5 cents for a plastic bag. And the goal of that is to reduce the amount of bags. We had another success with styrofoam, where we now have a ban on polystyrene, which is what styrofoam is made out of. It's a specific brand name, but most styrofoam is that. And that we now have that ban in effect for takeout containers. So they now have to be made out of biodegradable or compostable materials. So legislation is a way that we can also try to move the dial in a big way, in addition to kind of working on behavior change. And then finally, we also do put in some structural controls in some of the streams. So you can see that picture in the middle there that kind of looks like a fence with a bunch of trash caught on it. That is a trash trap. And those are something that we put into some of the streams, and we kind of design them based on that specific stream. And what that does is it traps the trash in that specific spot before it gets out into the river. And so it's obviously a Band-Aid approach, right? But it allows us to collect that trash in that spot. So we're reducing it from getting into the river, but we also then sort that trash, and we are able to collect data on the type of trash that we're seeing. We can see changes and patterns in terms of, is the bag bill working? Is it decreasing the amount of bags? What about styrofoam? Are we seeing an increase in bottles? Why? Where? Right? So this actually gives us data, which helps us with our advocacy efforts when we are seeking for legislation and policy changes. It makes a huge difference if we have actual data, rather than saying like, hey, we see bottles of water floating in the river all the time. That's an anecdote, right? But if we can have data showing like, hey, we've seen X% uptick in plastic water bottles, this is the trash that we're seeing, we need to do something about this. So the trash traps are useful in that way to collect data. Obviously, we need to address the volume of stormwater runoff, right? So as I previously mentioned, we work with a lot of local and federal governments, the environmental community. There's a lot of great organizations working on the river, working on the Chesapeake Bay that we partner with all the time. Of course, citizen action as well. We do a lot of work trying to engage and activate new audiences, right? We were always trying to create new constituencies of people who care about the river. I don't know how we're doing on time, Absa, but I can fly through these next slides pretty quickly. But this one, I just wanted to, what's that? Oh, sorry. We're good, okay.
You're good, yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we have to reduce that volume of stormwater, right? Because as I said at the beginning, that really is sort of the root of a lot of our problems, is that we just have so much stormwater coming in and bringing all this pollution with it. So bioretentions are one way to try to slow that down. We've probably all seen them, even if you are familiar with the term. I'm sure you've seen them along the sidewalks, along roadways and parking lots. And these are essentially planted areas. They're engineered structures, but they're planted areas that can absorb some of that stormwater, right? So rather than having it just rush off the road and go into the storm drain and go in a pipe and end up out in the river, it goes into this sort of intermediate planted area where there's plants and a specific soil medium that can absorb that water, and those plants can really slow it down so we don't have all that runoff going in at the same time. This is what they look like, right? These are some bioretention projects at some schools in Prince George's County. We're probably also familiar with rain barrels and cisterns, right? Again, the strategy here is to just slow that water down so it's not all going into the system at the same time. Of course, more plants throughout the watershed is a huge part of our strategy. As I mentioned at the very beginning, that one of the best things that we can do is really make the land more like a sponge rather than the funnel that we've sort of made it to be, where we're funneling all of our water away from us as quickly as we can, getting it away out into our waterways. But instead, by using plants, right, and kind of mimicking those natural systems, that allows that water to soak into the ground, slow down, and then we aren't ending up with so much runoff and so much pollution. I briefly just wanted to show this slide, which talks about that we use native plants in all of our plantings, right? So a lot of times people are like, okay, great, well, we just need more lawns, right? We need more grass. But what we really need is, there's specific types of plants that have much deeper root structures that are able to absorb a lot more water. So over here, you can see this is grass, right? You can see the roots of grass are very, very shallow. Whereas you can see some of these other native plants, their root structures are much thicker, much deeper. So they're able to, hold the soil in place and also absorb that much more water, preventing that much runoff. I just wanted to mention this program. It's an example of one of the programs that we run, because as I said, we do a lot of work to try to improve water quality, but also to engage the community. So this program that we do is called the Watershed Stewards Academy. We do this every spring and every fall, and it's 8 different sessions. And essentially what we do is people sign up for the class, and it's usually 4 Tuesday evenings and 4 Saturdays. And we teach them all about the river. What are the issues facing the river? What are the problems? What are the solutions? What are the resources available? And what can they do to help? And then at the end, they do a capstone project where maybe they build a rain garden in their community, or maybe they organize, one of those mural projects that I mentioned on the storm drains. And so this is a really great way that we can empower people, that help them learn about the river, and then also provide them with the knowledge, but also the resources to then be able to do projects in their own community, so that it's very much grassroots driven what's happening. It's not, just me saying, hey, we should do this. It really is people from communities all around the watershed participating in this class, learning from other people in the class, getting connected to those resources, and then implementing their own project. And this is my last slide here, I think, and this just talks about some other opportunities to get involved in ways that we try to get people engaged. So we do a lot of volunteer events with a lot of our restoration projects. So when I mentioned how we do a lot of tree planting or rain gardens, we always try to get volunteers to help us with the implementation of those projects. We also do a lot of boat tours and paddle nights, getting people out on the river. Like Absa said, the river at one point wasn't safe for boating, but it now is, which is great news. So it meets boating standards, and in fact, in the past year, it meets swimming standards the majority of the time as well. So we're not there yet, but we are quickly making progress, especially thanks to that Clean Rivers project that you mentioned. And so we do a lot of work of getting people out on the water so they can see the river, can change their mind about it, and they can see that it's actually a very, very beautiful place, even now, even though it has its challenges. But we see bald eagles, we see fox, we see beavers, we see all kinds of stuff on the river. We could drop you out on the boat in the middle of the river. You'd never know you were in the middle of the city, right? So it really is a tremendous resource, and we want people to be able to get out there and see it. And then you can just see that we also do, again, a lot of other education programs, like the Watershed Stewards Academy, as well as a lot of school-based programs as well. So there's the Anacostia there. You can see that is right, taken just south of Bladensburg, so right up near the confluence of the river. And I will turn it back over to you, Absa. Or Andrea, maybe I'm turning it over to you, I'm not sure.
I think we could probably just turn it over to me if you'd like. Okay. If I share my screen, I'll just take over from yours. So yeah. Or you could even stop sharing. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, perfect. That works. Okay. Well, thanks, Ariel. That was really fascinating. I'm kind of very far away from the work that you are both doing. And so it's so enlightening just to see the different approaches, and like some of the patterns are the same and then some of them are really different. So there's a lot of things that struck me about your presentation and the work that you're doing that was really inspiring. And I'm going to say this is definitely something completely different in a way, but it's all very intersectional in the work that we're all doing. So I'll tell you, I'm Andrea Palframan, and I work with an organization called RAVEN, which stands for Respecting Aboriginal Values and Environmental Needs. So I'll be speaking from my personal perspective here as a settler of Irish ancestry who's living on the unceded territories of the Halkominum speaking peoples in what's known as British Columbia. It's also known as Coast Salish Territory. So first of all, I want to address why a non-BIPOC person would be presenting on the topic of environmental racism. And hopefully I'm taking some of these elementary principles of this anti-racism work on so that I can free up my BIPOC colleagues so they can work on organizing. But yeah, you'll hear more and more about how Indigenous led this work is, and I owe a huge debt to all of the people whose tireless work is supporting my ability to be part of this movement. So just start sharing screen here. So yes, this is RAVEN. RAVEN is a registered charity. Our mission is to raise funds for Indigenous peoples' access to justice. So we're the only nonprofit organization in Canada that does this work. We use the power of the crowd to fund access to justice for Indigenous peoples. So, you know, when you were talking, Ariel, about how hard it is sometimes to get people involved in lawsuits, we feel that, but that's entirely what we do. So yeah, really, really always trying to educate people about the intersections of environmental justice and Indigenous rights, because through enforcing rights in the courts, you can really achieve amazing things that benefit what we like to think of as our common descendants, you know, future generations that are descended from us all. And that's our common interest. So Indigenous peoples in Canada have some of the most powerful environmental rights in the world, but those rights are meaningless if they can't afford to uphold them in court. So thanks to RAVEN, our Indigenous partners have defeated the odds, as in, you know, being outspent 100 to 1, and have won time and time again in court. So we've stopped pipelines, we've pushed back against tar sands expansion, halted open pit mines, and created better laws. Next slide here. Okay, there we go. So a little primer in how things work in Canada. Essentially, Canada has fundamentally enshrined racist practices into our legal system. And that, of course, spills over to every system. We are essentially South Africa, and indeed apartheid was modeled after our reserve or township system that disenfranchised the original stewards of the land and placed them into tiny reserves. When colonists first arrived, they used the doctrine of discovery to claim lands in the name of foreign kings. The assumption of terra nullius, empty land, attempted to nullify ownership and legal frameworks that were in fact long established by the estimated 60 to 100 million Indigenous peoples who lived on Turtle Island. Very similar to what happened in the US. So, you know, environmentalism is all about who controls the land, really, fundamentally. And then following that, what happens to that land, air, and water, what choices we make. So environmental racism is about policies and practices that aim to place control of that land in the hands of people based on assumed racial supremacy. So simply, on Turtle Island, white supremacists forcibly removed Indigenous peoples from their land through genocidal practices. The deliberate spread of smallpox and disease, the wipeout of the buffalo, which was the staple food of Plains people, and forcible removal to reserves that comprise such a small fraction of the lands required to sustain life that traditional economies collapsed, and Indigenous peoples were reduced to the barest survival. The residential school system in Canada aimed to take the Indian out of the child in a program of forced cultural assimilation that devastated cultures and pushed languages to the brink of extinction. Though Canada signed treaties with many nations, the guarantees in those treaties to hunt, fish, gather, and practice culture on traditional territories, and in the words of the treaty, for as long as the sun shines and the rivers flow, were completely invalidated because colonizers pushed ever deeper onto Indigenous lands and further displaced them. In many places, the lands and waters that make up these traditional territories of indigenous peoples are so degraded that they can't make up livelihoods, either because they don't have access to land or the land is so environmentally damaged that the treaty's promises aren't worth the paper they're written on. So for 500 years, indigenous peoples have not been considered stakeholders on lands outside of reserves, lands that in fact they have deep ecological knowledge about. So how would that be if that were to change? In our environmental racism, we miss the very richness embodied in the lands we strove to take over. We miss the powerful web of laws that arose from thousands of years of close observation and dedicated stewardship of ecosystems by indigenous peoples. We literally paved over and swept aside those laws to usher in so-called Enlightenment principles that had no roots or origins in the particulars of North American soil. We attempted to plant a monoculture where once there was a richly biodiverse storyscape, intended to instruct human beings in how to conduct themselves in relation to the natural world. So stories in indigenous law are like deeds to the land. There's cautionary tales, instruct tales, tales that also became like deeds in the double meaning of the word, in that these oral histories are now being used in court as proof that there is pre-existing title to lands and waters held by indigenous nations who have never given up or ceded their territories to colonial powers. In colonial conservation thinking, by contrast, early environmentalists made these policies which said if we could just preserve these little pockets of wilderness and set those lands aside as sacred, we would be fulfilling our duty to protect other species and biodiversity. And our society, as it were, could kind of drive around these little postage stamps of sacredness and conduct business as usual outside of them. So by taking a conservation approach, which assumes that human use is at odds with ecological protection, we perpetuate environmental racism. We assume that indigenous peoples, along with really all other humans, are inherently incapable of living in a way that preserves or even enhances ecological values. Conservation on stolen land has meant indigenous peoples have been shut out of their own lands in the name of conservation. And these conservationists have missed this huge pool of knowledge and ignored particular sets of practices that, in fact, produced the forests and wetlands in the state that our colonial antecedents encountered them. So, things like controlled burnings produce the old growth forests that we think of as these, iconic, the redwoods or the Pacific Northwest forests. The plains were shaped through controlled burning and the buffalo were nurtured through those sorts of practices. So, we're beginning, thankfully, to crack open that idea that conservation is about shutting out humans and welcoming the knowledge of indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of the land for so long. So from a report from Policy Options, which is a Canadian think tank, they say the establishment of parks has often led to conflict and created injustices for local people who have cultural ties and legal rights to these areas, because land protection often means pushing them out or limiting their access. Because humans rely upon and have deep cultural ties to lands worldwide, global conservation goals can be met effectively in the future only by expanding networks of protected areas thoughtfully. In particular, expansion must occur in ways that create synergies between human livelihoods and conservation, rather than through gated conservation models that create environmental injustices. And hearing about your work, Ariel and Absa, doing this kind of not conservation work. It's like it's environmental protection work in the context of, a city, an urban environment where human livelihoods, human lives, economies, it's all kind of layered on top. And it's about engaging people in this sense that we can be stewards. We don't have to exist and work sort of in this model where there's a pure ecology and then there's human culture, and the two are at odds, because we can actually live together. And indigenous peoples, having lived for 10,000 years in a very non-destructive way on these very lands and waters, offer us a real model of how to do that. So here are 3 ways forward in evolving out of this conservation model that was rooted in environmental racism, and moving towards that indigenous-led understanding of stewardship, where we work in relationship with one another. So the first one would be actually enforcing treaty rights so that treaty lands are in good enough shape that indigenous people can meaningfully sustain their cultures. The second way forward is establishing Aboriginal title to unceded territories. So that's in places like where I live, where nations have never signed treaties and are therefore still the legal title holders to their land. But this is only made real if they can prove title in court. And I'll tell you about some cases that Raven's working on right now that are really exciting, that are moving that forward. And then the third one is this tribal park model. So a tribal park declaration is a land use management plan that aims to foster ecosystem sustainability in support of indigenous treaty rights. And that's kind of a lot of words, but I'll give you an example of what that really looks like. So first of all, talking treaty rights, Raven is involved in a case called the tar sands trial. The Beaver Lake Cree are located right at the heart of Canada's tar sands, which is the largest industrial project on Earth. The tar sands involve both open pit mining of bitumen and in situ steam extraction, which pulls the bitumen from deep within the earth. Both methods cause devastating water pollution in the extraction and mining process. And the product is one of the dirtiest forms of carbon on the planet. So the Beaver Lake Cree are taking on the Canadian government and industry in an unprecedented legal action to stop the tar sands expansion and protect their lands. The case argues that their lands, waters, and resources have become inaccessible and unusable for the exercise of their treaty rights. You know, the hunting, fishing, gathering of plants that was guaranteed in the treaty. And those things are not things from history. I mean, those activities constitute the community's basis for food security, livelihood, and really identity. So this will be the first time the courts will have to consider whether the government has authorized too much industrial development without meaningful regard to treaty rights. So victory in this case would become a really strong precedent for treaty holding nations, which is most of the nations in Canada, because it would force new projects to be evaluated not piecemeal, but according to their cumulative impact on treaty rights. So what it would do is force an ecosystems-based approach to land use management, because regulators would be made accountable to the needs of Indigenous peoples and the natural environment's health, which they rely on to survive and thrive. And in fact, which we all rely on, to survive. So the tar sands trial has been called a game changer. It's been 10 years, so it's expensive and exhausting, but the case is really poised to forever change the way Indigenous lands can be turned into sacrifice zones for profit at the expense of the stewards of the land and water who've been forced to live in the fallout zones of these destructive industries. The next case that we're involved in here is with the Secwepemc Nation. So with Raven support, the Secwepemc Nation are pushing for legal recognition of pre-existing title to land and waters that has never been ceded. So they have never signed a treaty. They claim title to 180,000 square kilometers. It's in the interior of British Columbia. So if you think of Washington State, kind of Spokane, just go north and you'll hit Secwepemc territory. So their determination to pursue title to their lands is grounded in Indigenous law and their concepts, which involve an obligation to care to protect land, water, and air within their territory. If they were to win this title case, it would facilitate a new, healthier economic development and resource development that seeks to balance ecology, people, land, and economy. So their land title is about building and maintaining long-term sustainable economic development within a healthy and thriving environment. So it's essentially about ecological protection with Indigenous values, but within a lived human cultural context. So not conservation over here, or Indigenous people over here and industry over here, but actually an integrated model. So this title case will facilitate the application of established knowledge into the future management and development of the land and resources for future Secwepemc peoples, but also for settlers like myself. So this integration is really part of that reconciliation that's happening in Canada, and I think in the United States as well, where we're looking at Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding and trying to forge proper relationships after a really difficult, painful, and brutal history. So this is my last example, and this is an example of a tribal park. So Desico Tribal Park is a proposed 300,000 hectare park that will be, again, in that kind of central British Columbia area. This is a nation called the Chilcotin, and you can see in the slide there's pictures of people on horses. It's roamed by wild horses and is a very, very beautiful mountainous grassland. There's also salmon runs and a huge amount of wetlands that sustain salmon runs that flow to Coast Salish people. So, millions of people depend on this area, highland area, being healthy. So the Chilcotin leadership and communities have constantly maintained and protected their responsibility to care for this land. They fought numerous threats from hydroelectrical development, industrial logging, and mining. So Raven comes in the sense that we have supported the Chilcotin in court in their decades-long fight to stop a mining company from turning the sacred lake of Talton Bay into a tailings pond. So the mining company essentially said, well, that's not a lake, it's actually just a pond, and we would like to use it for our tailings. And the community has pushed back really hard and won many legal victories. It's sort of like a zombie mine that just kept getting resurrected. Every time they beat it in court, it would sort of reconstitute and come up as a whole, it's called the new prosperity mine now. So we have just been hammering at them for many years, but in that process, there was a determination to talk about, well, what do we want to do with this land? If it has to be defined in a way, then what specific definition can we make? So this is where the Desigo Park emerged. So it emerged from these legal victories, but also from the struggle with the help of Raven community. And it really offers a way forward in self-determination and indigenous ecological management for future generations. So I just want to end with this quote from John Boros, who is an Anishinaabe lawyer and scholar, and he's a member of Raven's Legal Advisory Board. He says, we have law because we're beautiful as indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. And we also have law because we're messed up. So law is a site of healing because it pulls upon the social, upon the natural, upon the political. So for many indigenous peoples, law can be a site of healing because it attempts to address our relationships, not just our relationships where things have gone wrong, but also aspirationally where we hope to be as peoples. And I could never say it so beautifully, but that's really what Raven's all about. And that's what we're attempting to draw people into, is what is a promise of legal remedies to ecological destruction. So thank you so much for listening.
All right, so thank you everyone for coming to this webinar, and thank you to our amazing speakers. That concludes our ThinkOcean webinar on environmental racism. Yeah, thank you so much again, and have a wonderful afternoon. Okay. Bye everyone.